Thank you, and we'll welcome our other speakers up to the stage for 10 minutes or so of questions. And the questions hopefully will end up on the screen if anyone's put any through on the app. So we'll just wait for a moment for those to come up. Right. So there's, you guys may well be able to read the questions. I thought I'd start off with one of my own, as the chair's privilege, I guess. And that's the question of self-control. And it's for Richie in particular, but the others may have a view as well. Richie, do you think the findings you have on a reduction in self-control in certain children, do you think they mediate poor outcomes, or do you think it's a marker of something that's gone before, something that's happened either in pregnancy or the very early years that presents itself as a reduction in self-control or executive functioning, and therefore goes on to create the disparities that you've identified?
So it's both. So self-control as early as age 3 has to be seen as an outcome of what's occurred prior, so from conception through to age 3. So if the developing fetus is swimming in a soup of all sorts of substance poisons and poor nutrition and high stress, that's not really great for the substrate, the physiological substrate, which is the frontal lobe of self-control. So you've got an option of try to intervene to prevent this from occurring in the first place. The thing about age 3 is that it's the point at which, if you haven't done universal or high or targeted intervention for those people that have high risk, it's the first point at which you can differentiate individuals in terms of whether they have low or medium or high, and you can do that accurately. Much before that, it's too early, it's too messy. So you don't get prediction at age 2 in any meaningful way between attempts to measure differences in self-control and how a person does down the track. So it's best to wait. I see at the top question there's something about medication. What I should say about self-control is it's a skill. It's like any skill. It's like learning to play the recorder or to paint or to sing or to pass a rugby ball like Aaron Smith does. The more you practice it, the better you get at it. We're all born with tendencies of all sorts. Some will have tendency towards lower, medium or high self-control, but we can all improve by practicing. And so if you identify differences in self-control as early as age 3, then you can do something about it via, for example, the early childhood education curriculum, if you wanted to make some differences. And there are a number of programs right now that have been trialled around New Zealand that are trying to do just that.
Just as part of the same answer, I think that executive functioning in a neuroscience context continues to develop over quite a length of time. So, we always talk about adolescents acquiring a frontal lobe, and we send our young men off to war and they're 18 and 20-year-olds, and because they're bulletproof, but by the time they get to 26, 27, they're starting to have acquired a frontal lobe and starting to make some good decisions in their lives. And a number of us have watched that happen with our own children, and I've certainly watched it with the quality of parenting of a number of young men particularly. So I don't think it's ever too late. I think a nurturing serve and return type approach to supporting people actually makes a significant difference, and you can improve the situation.
I'd like to move to the question at the top of the screen now around adverse child events. All of you have either spoken directly or alluded to it. And as you can see from the question, how can we strive for better social acceptance of adverse child events to get community ownership and participating in seeking solutions? And Matere, in your clinical practice, you must come across, as we all do, people, patients, who, despite all of the adverse events that you're seeing, still seem to thrive and do well. And I wonder if you have a view on how that is mediated, and what are some of the things from Te Ao Māori that you might be able to talk about as resiliency factors or strengths?
Yeah. I always struggle with the idea of resilience, because resilience as a concept, you think about people building resilience as a result of those external things that are hitting against them all the time. And so it's a real balance between taking away those adverse events in childhood to allow all the children to thrive and flourish and do well, versus actually building up. And there's almost some victim blaming in that idea that you need to be more resilient. And so it is difficult. Having said that, I think the whānau that I see love their children. And I think if I was to say anything to people, it's love your children, be kind and love. And we've heard about this, the fact that neurons develop, children feel that they can do and contribute to the world. And so I think this idea of being kind and loving to our children, and everyone says, you certainly change being a parent in your practice. But I think I've always been aware that if you're loving to children, and perhaps it's come from my own experience with my grandfather, and recognising actually all of his mokopuna have done extremely well because they had this person saying, you can do it.
Do you have a view?
I had a recent experience of listening to the story of a man of around 45 who'd spent most of his adult life in jail. And he'd been rescued really when he came out of jail by a whānau worker who was essentially oiling the wheels in his life. And when I heard the story, and when he described how he was now relating to his children from an earlier relationship and to a current one, it was clear to me that he had had a very positive first 1,000 days, and that things had gone off the rails at school. So it was that early. So my sense was that he'd been able to turn his life around because actually he'd had what he needed in that early period, even though things had gone wrong later. So I've got a strong sense that your resilience actually comes from that positive first 1,000 days period, and that sets you up for the future. And it is much, much harder if you hadn't had that.
Thanks, Richie. In the longitudinal study, you obviously looked at positive factors as well. Did you get a feel for any of the things that we may be able to do to address some of these issues and therefore prevent this downward spiral that we see over the life course?
In the context of adverse child...
Yeah, and broader, the outcomes that you're talking about, but also as you say, the adverse child events that we see early on in life.
Yes, I mean, if I may just hark back to the question about, it was really about acceptance and acknowledgement and recognition of the importance of these adversities as playing an important role in setting the scene and having latent effects for bad outcomes down the track. I think we have had that in certain areas. For example, it's not arguable that abusing a child sexually under the age of 5 is a very bad thing to occur. And I think we have seen a broadening of what constitutes adversity in a nice way, and in a relevant way, and an evidence-based way, to include now pernicious forms of chronic neglect as equally damaging. So under that rubric of toxic stress, you can fit now a number of candidates that need to be addressed in a structural sense, but knowing that just trying to change the structure, the social determinants of health, will not happen overnight. It's important to try and build the skills within a person, such as executive control, and which is not just about sitting on strong emotions, but persisting in the face of challenge. And so it's not an either-or situation. You have to work on multiple fronts. And just as a positive example out of the evidence base, the social buffering of good social connection, or the buffering of good social connection, in terms of mitigating really adverse environments in which there's an excess of these adverse child adversities impinging on individuals, is now well established.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Boyd, I presume it's Boyd Swinburne in the front there, really, which is an interesting one. Given that you showed almost a linear relationship in the work that you did, there has been, from time to time, a belief among some politicians and others that would be better off targeting the high-risk end rather than making changes to shift the curve, if you like, which is the more public health. I presume that's the interpretation of the question. And I wondered what your thoughts on that were, given the distribution, but also given your experience of how we work. And I know people like Sir Michael Marmot have talked about this as well, and Geoffrey Rose, the other famous epidemiologist. So I just wondered if any of you have a view on how we should approach this, in either or, and how we might do that. Yeah.
I've got a view. I think it's both again. There's the solutions that come from the top down, and those obviously relate to inequity and poverty and reversing that. There are things that need to happen nationally, like te reo to become something that all children in New Zealand become good at. There's initiatives that require that national focus, but similarly there are things which need to happen from the bottom up, and we've got such a sizable problem in terms of the intergenerational impacts that we are looking at having to have a systems focus for that 20 or 30% of our population that have really struggled. And obviously, the Children's Commission will have different levels of, different numbers, but, we're going to find that it's at least 20% that need a major focus, and that's why I put in that slide of the support to a pregnancy and following through till the child's at least 5 years of age, and, it needs to be somebody that stays with them ongoing because the issue is one of engagement, and you have to facilitate that. So there's a bottoms-up component to helping with this, but also there are significant top-down components.
Material, yes, I think, and where you work, it's not an 80-20, it's probably more like a 60-40 in the wrong direction, and I wonder if you have some views on that as well.
Yeah, so James Nasru, who's done a lot of work and works with Michael Marmot in the UK, speaks to, if a health system wants to do one thing to address the social determinants, it's to address poverty. And if you look around New Zealand, a lot of our healthcare providers or DHBs are the biggest employers for Māori and Pacific people, but they're in cleaning, they're in contracting, they're in the kitchen, they're not in the doctor professional roles. So he says if you're going to do one thing, look at paying the living minimum wage. And to do that is going to not only address poverty in people's homes, it'll have long-term impact on the family and give more money into people's homes. So that would be, I think, a really simple thing for you to go back and do and make sure that everybody who's working in your organisation is on the living minimum wage.
Thank you. We've got time for one more. Oh,
if
yes,
I may
Richard.
just come back to the targeting versus the universal approaches, or the Geoffrey Rose sort of idea. And Marmot's made it reasonably popular in recent times, this idea of proportionate universalism, which is a very unwieldy term, which simply means that everyone gets something and those that need more get more. Now, that's something that most people endorse. When you try and operationalise that as a social policy maker, it's very hard. And what you end up doing is carving the system into its normal parts, which is, education's universal, but then we've got these kids who've soaked up Johan's slide of 4+ adversities before they even hit school. They need some special help. And in fact, where the research is going is that it shows that if you intervene at 4, you're too late, because these kids have already accrued a lot of adversity, and it's manifesting in terms of, without being overly reductionist, how their brain's operating and how ready they are to learn at school. And if you start 6 months behind, which is a figure that's often quoted, it's near impossible to catch up. In fact, the reverse happens. It deepens through time. And there's a whole bunch of biological and social processes interacting to embed that disadvantage and that sense of low self-worth, which then has its own consequences through time. So I'm very much a belt and braces person, because these things are commonly known as, the stuff we're talking about, wicked problems. That just means these are bloody hard to solve, and we're going to need to look at it every which way and bring everything we have to bear on the challenges that come in these forms.
Thank you. We've got a lot more questions and we're not going to be able to cover them all off. So I'd ask you to thank the speakers we've had. Stay where you are. And I'd like to ask Professor Mark Lane to come to the podium and launch the document Early Childhood.
Thanks very much, Pat. Nā mihi mahana kia koutou katoa. Ko hui hui mai he korero mo te mana at kitanga a tatau tamariki. Greetings to you all who have come to discuss the care and well-being of our children. I'd like to thank you also for the privilege of being a Pākehā adult physician who's here to launch a statement on childhood health. There are moral and ethical and economic arguments for investing in children. Children make up 1/5 of our population. They make up 100% of our future. They aren't my words, I'm actually quoting from our latest position statement, Early Childhood, the Importance of the Early Years. And as such, these words belong to each and every college member. Let me quickly talk to you about the three arguments. Morally, every child has a right to health and well-being. These rights are set out in the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Children, and Australia and New Zealand have both ratified that convention. As a consequence, our nations are ethically bound to remove any and all barriers to the health and well-being of our children. However, we know that the health and well-being of our children is being compromised by the inequitable distribution of resources, and this inequity has economic consequences. It compromises the health of children, holding back their development and keeping them from reaching their full potential. According to studies, the disadvantage that children have has huge negative effects on the economic activity of our countries. We have moral, ethical, and economic reasons for action on early childhood, especially the first 1,000 days. And this is why our college has developed this position statement. Our statement makes a case for early childhood investment, outlines how those investments should be made, and makes 47 recommendations for action. I'll not read every 47, you can get them from the position statement. But they include implementing universal sustained postnatal home visiting program in both Australia and New Zealand. In Australia, extending paid parental leave to 6 months for either parent. In Australia and New Zealand, introducing mandatory regulations to restrict the marketing of unhealthy diet to children. Funding development, implementation, evaluation, and rollout of integrated early childhood programs designed to help vulnerable children and disrupt intergenerational poverty. In Australia, committing to the long-term sustainable funding of the National Partnership on Universal Access to Early Childhood Education beyond 2021. Most importantly, making the safety and well-being of children a paramount factor in all policy and legislative decisions by all governments. After all, as the statement says, children make up 100% of our future. I'd like to congratulate the members of our Paediatric Policy and Advocacy Committee for producing the statement, and I particularly want to thank Pat for his work. And the other members of the working group, Associate Professor John Eastwood, Katrina Hannon, Dr. Vanessa Sarkowski, Dr. Lydia So, Dr. Simon Rowley, and Dr. Ninjan Rajaput. And I want to also thank the college policy and advocacy staff members who have assisted in this, Yvonne Gritschinder, Louise Hardy, and Veronica Neves. I encourage you all to read this position statement and to publicly support the actions that it recommends. After all, our children are our future. Noriera tēnā koutou katoa.
So that's the end of our program for today. Thank you all for attending. It's been a challenging and really interesting program. I think what it does is starts to identify the roles, the overlapping and tightly coordinated roles that adult physicians and paediatricians play and will play even more into the future. So a perfect topic to address at the collegial meeting for us all. So again, I'd like you to thank the speakers again and Professor Lane for launching the position statement. Thank you.